Okay, so Rick Mixter is an award-winning Great Lakes maritime historian, videographer, producer, news reporter. He has worked with PBS, the Outdoor Channel, the Discovery Channel, and next month you can catch him on the National Geographic Channel. Rick also loves museums, especially ours in Dade County. He recently wrote a book after 30 years of interviews with people who built, sailed, and dove on the Edmund Fitzgerald. Without further ado, here's Rick.
Thank you, brother. It is great to be back here. This is my home, and to kick off my season here, it really touches my heart, and to have an overflow crowd. My apologies to my friends in the back. But it just really means a lot to me, especially after coming out of COVID, and we remember how we couldn't get together, and now here we are in force. And this story too, as you know, I had some time off during COVID, as many of us did. And I wrote a Bottle of Goodbyes. And then I thought, you know what, if the job market wasn't looking any better for an old guy like me, and I thought maybe I should finally finish that Edmund Fitzgerald book I've been talking about. And that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to take some license to Mr. Gordon Lightfoot. I hope he doesn't mind. I'm sure he doesn't mind. But there's some things in the song that I love so dearly that are incorrect. And we're going to kind of correct that. But before we do, I can't believe I got a note as my book started to sell. Somebody said, I watched you on the Bay TV station. I went, well, where are you? And his name is Bob. In fact, he watches this channel from New Jersey. So I hope everybody could say hi to Bob in New Jersey for me. Ready? Hi, Bob. We're thrilled that so many people tune in beyond just the museum. To really absorb this museum, you have to come here. This is the most fantastic. To have an entire floor dedicated to maritime history, especially Bay City, Bay County's history, which I just scratched the surface on. And we'll touch a little bit even with the Fitzgerald story. You really need to spend some time here. It's a fantastic museum, and the people here do a fantastic job of sharing that history as well. So, Bob, underway, the Edmund Fitzgerald. We know the name, we know everything about it from the song. We know it was the largest freighter ever lost in the Great Lakes. We know when it was built, it was the largest at the time. But as I started to dig into it, I had a lot of questions. Why did they build something so big? Why did it take until 1956, 57? Did they decide? And why was it that Northwest Mutual Life Insurance had any interest in building a freighter? And it turns out that, first of all, the connection to Northwest Mutual was pretty obvious. Edmund Fitzgerald, if you look at the policy, there's his name right on there, the president and later CEO of Northwest Mutual. So here's a life insurance company. Their job is you buy a policy. If you die prematurely, you get a payout. That money is usually less than you put in. So where does it come from? Well, they raise money. That's how they get their money, through real estate dealings, through the railroads in the 1880s and the 1890s. And eventually, the Northwest Mutual started looking at the shipping market. They said, wow, they're hauling a lot of iron ore on the Great Lakes. So they started looking into ships. And sure enough, they bought into a fleet of ships that were sold. And Wilson Transit actually did the actual work with it. In fact, I'll show you. Look at this one, the Joseph Wood. You see the W on the back for Wilson. This was owned by the same company that owned the Edmund Fitzgerald. Built in Bay City, the Richard Marshall, initially came out in 1953, went through a couple of different ownerships before Ford had it for a while, but this is one of the last of the big freighters built in Michigan especially, the Joseph Wood. Edmund Fitzgerald, we saw his name on the policy. Edmund, long line of shipping history. He went into banking, he went into life insurance, but his dad was actually, William Fitzgerald, had a ship named for him. Look it on the back, W.E. Fitzgerald. This is launched in 1906. Sadly, William Fitzgerald was killed in an explosion. He went to his cottage. Acetylene gas was in the basement, and it blew up and killed him. So he wasn't at this launch. His mother was there. Edmund Fitzgerald, who the ship was named for, is in this crowd in 1906. This is about 6 miles away from where the Fitz was built in Wyandotte. So W. Fitzgerald wasn't there, but his grandpa was a ship's captain. He was involved in shipbuilding, especially in Marine City area, Algonac. And Fitzgerald name goes way back. So that's kind of the connection. Also, one of the big investments I found out in the book that I've never seen published before was the fact that Northwest Mutual had money wrapped up into Silver Bay Harbor. This is a brand new location. In the 1950s, there was a professor who figured out that he could take waste iron ore that was all inside, like powder and silica. he could find a way to extract it through magnets, roll it into pellets, and make taconite pellets. So here was an industry that was dying. This guy came in and said, well, give me all the scrap and mining out the stuff that wasn't as rich and turn it into a real product they could sell. And Silver Bay was going to be the big place they would do this. And Silver Bay was just a field. I mean, it was a little tiny bay. No people really lived there. Beaver Bay was its original name. And they built an entire city, Reserve Mining did, just for this. And this is what Northwest Mutual put their investment there, and then into these 3 ships, and then, of course, to build the largest freighter on the Great Lakes. So here we are, Great Lakes Engineering Works. There'd been a 6-year lapse in building ships. The William Clay Ford, which was, as you know, how many people know about the Ford and the Fitzgerald? See, I get a guidance here on how much we know. We'll get into that story a little bit. The Clay Ford was built here for the Ford family for hauling iron ore really pretty close to there where the factory was by Zug. And Great Lakes Engineering Works turned that one out. And then it got quiet for a while, and the ship workers would kind of bounce from Bay City, where we were working, Defoe, and they'd go into other Manitowoc area and such to build ships. But this one had big news, big ship coming out. They were going to build 3 in a row. It was going to be the Fitzgerald, the Homer, and the Jackson. So it was good news for the Michigan ship industry, but sad news in the fact that these were really the last 3 that we were going to build, especially in the Detroit area. And that ended 200 plus years of building ships on the river. Here's Fitzgerald's stern before she was completed. You can see this giant gantry crane. And in my book and in my documentary, I talked to one of the guys that's 60 feet above watching the construction. Well, we'll also talk today, we'll hear from a guy that was involved in drilling the holes for the rivets. There's rivets in the bottom of the ship. The rest of it was all built with a production weld. And a lot of people were suspect with this. It was so fast. It was 3 times faster than any other shipyard. And these guys have been turning out welded ships for over 50 years at that point. So this process that they did made a lot of people wondered, is that why it broke? Because it was faster. But I argue the Jackson is still sailing. In fact, we see it in the Saginaw River come right by here quite often. So I don't think so. And as I build my case here for what happened to the Fitzgerald, I think we'll see something a little more obvious than structural. Here's some footage from the building. This is the keel lane. So here's your keel right here. And you can see the plate coming down and all the big wigs come up to sign. This is big news for the area. Hull 301, and then they launched it in subsections. So this is part of the cargo hold on the top and the outer part of the ship. And these big modules could be built simultaneously along the slip and then launched like this, and then the gantry would pick them up. And imagine how fast that would go together with all of these different sections coming in. And this is one of the first times they kind of used this system to do it. We'd been building subsections before, but this is really for this. And you can see this is the ballast tank in here, the walkway into the tunnel that you can walk below deck to go to the back to the kitchen or to the galley on the boat. Here's the big subdivision. These are the watertight bulkheads on the Fitzgerald, which it had 2. The subsections between the 3 big main holds were not watertight. And watch this, big splash. And notice it's not complete. The subsection up, the poop deck's up, but you don't see part of the boat deck. You don't see the smokestack, obviously, and all the material that'd be on there. Forward, we see it up to the, really to the forecastle, and that's about it. This is the actual building up of the area where the Fitzgerald family would come up. So Edmund Fitzgerald would give words. And I wanted to introduce you to a Bay City guy. Did anybody here remember Roland Peters? Sometimes we'll see people, do you remember? Well, you helped me get the interview. I had a call that this guy, and of course all of my interviews with old timers are my favorite because they're just characters to talk to. Roland was working here at Defoe. It slowed down. His father was working down in Detroit. He went down there and actually picked up work when the Fitzgerald came in. So his job was to drill these holes, and he hated going down into what he called the sea chest, the very bottom of the ship. Once it was together, it was crawling through a cave and then drilling these holes. And he'd actually pay the guy to give him a sharp bit, because he got paid, I think, 30 cents or something a hole or something like that to get it done. Most of these workers hardly making anything to do it. But I want you to hear a quick interview from him as he talks about all the bigwigs coming in. There's been, if you read the newspaper and the books, they say 10,000 people showed up. I've seen footage from 4 different cameras there, and not taking anything away from this is a big deal for Detroit. I get it. but there's not 10,000 people there. I know a crowd when I see one, and there's not, they say 5,000 boats pulled alongside. You'll see in the footage that it's not necessarily true, but it was a big deal, except for maybe Roland. It was kind of like a normal day for him.
A couple of hundred thousands of them would show up at lunch, and they would all come in there and they would give all their speeches, and blah, blah, blah. And then they would just send her in.
Was it a pretty involved process? You mentioned a trigger to actually...
Yeah, they have what they call a trigger mechanism. They would use hammers, sledgehammers, and they use wedges, and they'd pick the ship up, a little bit, maybe an eighth of an inch, just enough so that they could move this wood around. And then they would trigger it down, and down she'd go.
Don't sit on the other side where the wave would come at you. And people have figured this out. When I was at the launch of the Mackinac, everybody was, the new Mackinac that came out of the cutter, went to Marinette, and on the other edge I saw a camera, and luckily it was waterproof because that wave came over and just doused them. And I think anybody who works there kind of knows. The coolest place to ride, though, would be obviously up here. This right here is the stern section it's already been launched, obviously. And this right here stanchion, this upright right here, is where these guys all stand. And part of the deal is that each one of these people I rode in, it's just not a high honor to be there, but you have to work, right? So their whole job was that they actually had to run inside and then go very deep into the ship and see if there were any leaks. And let's see if we can't get Ed to tell us what that was all about.
That's me over here at the stanchion here. When that thing went in, it tipped over and headed toward the water, and I had a death grip on that. And they were talking about that double bottom. The reason I was on that thing when it was launched, the rest of these guys and I, our job, they gave us a flashlight and some chalk. And I finally, after we got in the water, I said, what do we do now? He says, now we go down at the bottom, in those double bottoms, which is just the keel plates below the water. And he says, you listen for running water in case there's it hits the far side and springs a leak. I says, if you hear running water, you're going to hear running feet. But that's how I got to be on the Fitz when it went in.
Ed's dad was actually involved in one of the welding crews. He was above the welding crew. In fact, he would be Roland Peters' boss, as a matter of fact. So the ship came in, and obviously there was no big problems with the launch. There's always been a rumor that someone died of a heart attack at the actual launch. I've never seen an actual newspaper account of that, and I've searched both Windsor's side and also Detroit. That's not to say it didn't happen, because it might have happened at he passed away at a hospital, and they didn't really attribute it to this. But he certainly didn't die there, or at least the newspaper didn't cover it. You can tell this old picture because of the old radar that's on board here. You don't see, actually you do see right here, that is the bow thruster. So this is after 1970 when they put the thrusters, a propeller up front here to help them navigate a little bit better. And we'll discuss a couple of different pieces about this. Here's the lifeboat that we'll obviously find afterwards. This is a crane that the stewards use to bring groceries on board. That's actually wrapped around the propeller now on the bottom. It's very bizarre. So a lot of questions we still have about it. But when Fitz came out and started breaking, obviously you're the biggest thing on the Great Lakes, right? You can haul more cargo, 30,000 tons of taconite, and they instantly started breaking records at the Sioux. The big question to me was, well, when the Homer came out, it was a foot longer than the Fitzgerald, but the Fitzgerald kept besting the records again. When the Ryerson came out and the Sykes, these bigger vessels, how were they still coming through with big cargoes? In the book, I explain it. Is that a good tease for the book? I'll let you know that the cook was nervous many times because they would rob their fuel. So when they got to the Sioux locks and got measured for how much you can carry through the locks, they would carry less fuel. And the cook said, that's great unless you get stuck out in the water in a storm. What do you do? Or he said you can't throw furniture inside the boilers, to make it run. So very interesting. But they did. They broke several cargo hauling records. I also started to find through my research that this was the ship that was out in every storm. As you look at the Weather Service, many ships, there was up to at least 40 of them that they would report actual conditions out on the water. This happened in 1940. You remember the big storm that happened in 40? We lost the Novadoc, we lost the Davik, and Of course, the Minch was torn in half. Over 60 sailors died. After that, the Weather Service said, why don't we have ships actually report in and give us the conditions that are out there, and we'll mix that with our forecast to get a better, accurate what's happening out on the water. Fitzgerald was one of those ships, and Fitzgerald was listed, and they have a picture of the Fitzgerald in the 60s. #1 ship for reporting big storms on Lake Superior. It broke through at least a dozen gale force storms. So if there was anything wrong with the ship, that flexing, and it was a very odd flexing that many of the sailors have told me, that vessel for some reason twisted very strangely, even in 10-foot seas. So that's where a lot of that came from. And I think that that's why it was pushed so hard. This is what taconite looks, and this is magnified many, many, many times. These look like marbles. And in fact, if I'm from the UP, I'm from the just south of Marquette, a little town called Sands. Our railroad tracks are purple with these, and this is the greatest slingshot ammunition you can ever get. We got into a lot of trouble with taconite, and it just shakes out of the cars, especially when the Tilden, the Empire mines were running, and especially when Escanaba was still shipping. We no longer use the docks there to haul iron ore, which is a real disappointment. But it certainly the railroad tracks are packed with this taconite everywhere. Fitzgerald carried over 1 billion of these individual pellets. It'd be 26,000 tons of these, and they're scattered all across the bottom. Footage from Captain Larson, who is the second captain, the first full-time captain, loading at Silver Bay. See the belt system? The Fitzgerald would actually get filled, and they would have lights on the sides that would tell if it was even. And so the first mate goes on the deck, and he monitors that loading to make sure it's correct. The Fitzgerald only had a loading manual for this dock. So this belt system, which was much different than the ones we see at Marquette or the ones that we're going to talk about at Burlington, had gravity-fed spouts that would come down, and you'd just spray and move them around and load, as best you could. This was a little more accurate. Here's a good storm. This is actually the Fitzgerald. Just incredible. I was doing a talk in Lansing, and this lady came up and she goes, if you can name the second captain on the Fitzgerald, I'll give you his movies. And I said, it was Nels Larson. She goes, oh, she turns out to be a niece of Nels. And so this is how doing these lectures work out so great for me. Here's going into a storm, and look at the waves and stuff. Again, this is on board the Edmund Fitzgerald, and we're seeing that, they didn't shy away from it. In fact, the cook told me, he said about Captain McSorley, he literally told him, you don't make money at anchor. That means if you put down the hook, you're not making any money. So you challenge the storms, you get through, and you make it happen. Also on board the Fitzgerald was another captain. McCarthy, the first mate, was actually a captain who had several ships, but he accidentally ran the Benny Tate aground and got bounced down to first mate. And then when he was offered a captain's job back, he preferred to stay on Fitz. Fitzgerald had air conditioning. It was outfitted by Hudson's Company in Detroit. It was the flagship. So anytime they wanted to wine and dine somebody from National Steel or any of the big steel companies or anybody, the shipping companies, they would take the Fitzgerald. So you had the best captain, you had the best cook, right, for feasts on board, and they ate very, very well. Talking to Red Bergner, it's amazing to really learn his story. And that's where I kind of depart from my friend Gordon Lightfoot. And in fairness, Gordon was already recording his album. It was the same year as they were just found the Fitzgerald. The news that was coming out was very rudimentary. So it's not fair. And people often tell me, Rick, it's not a documentary, it's a song. And I'm like, yes, it is. But you also want to make sure you get your facts straight, because if this is the only way people learn about this incredible shipwreck, the largest on the Great Lakes, I think you should get it right. And even more so, if you do go back and decide to change some lyrics, which he did in 2010, change the ones that are wrong. Don't change the ones that are right. So that's my bone to pick with him. The first one is coming back from some mill in Wisconsin. Sounds good, and people tell me, well, it rhymes better than the truth, because the mill is actually not in Wisconsin. They left from some dock in Wisconsin, but the mill is 80 miles up all the way to National Pellet in the middle of Minnesota. So not Wisconsin. It was way up here, and they actually had two plants up here, Butler and National, that were cranking out pellets, but the Fitzgerald didn't normally go here. This, in fact, the guy at the loading dock was brought in for testimony when the Fitz sank, and he was asked, how many times did you load the Fitz? He said, I only saw it once, the year it sank. He only saw it the one time there. So that did not make a lot of trips out of the Burlington. There were at least 6 that I saw times that had been there. But I don't know how much more if you look at the complete, catalog since 1958 when it went out. But this is not some mill in Wisconsin. In fact, there are no mills in Wisconsin, as a matter of fact. Why didn't they go to Silver Bay? 80%, 90% of the runs for the Fitzgerald were from Silver Bay all the way down to Toledo. In fact, she was so fast, she could do almost 16 miles an hour. They called her the Toledo Express because that was her route. All the way down through Lake Superior, straight down Lake Huron into the river system to Toledo, and then turn around and do it again over and over and over again. And mostly because that was, reserve mining. Actually, Columbia that ran the Fitzgerald chartered it for Northwest Mutual. They actually had a ship named Reserve because of, how much work they were doing there. So why didn't they go to Silver Bay? If you look at the headlines here, there was massive pollution coming out of the Planet Reserve. When they first designed it, the headline said, "We're throwing the old rock back into Lake Superior. The fish don't mind." Basically the DNR was saying, how could it be bad? Until in Duluth, they started getting higher cancer rates from asbestos. Now, whether or not that's linked, and as I look, you remember I was on TV5 for 8 years, on TV12 for 4 years. I'm a reporter at heart, so I dove into this to see, was it real? The asbestos numbers are not any higher than what I'm even seeing now and back. So we can do hind forecasting now to see what those casualty rates are, what those, literally the problem, it was not asbestos. But it was so bad a judge shut down Silver Bay for a short time until they realized they were losing millions of dollars, and this entire town of Silver Bay went, hey, you can't do that to us. So they finally came up with a compromise where Silver Bay would build ponds, push it into there, and then it could actually work with trying to filter it out before it went into our beautiful Lake Superior. So that's what was going on. It's never been connected to say this is why the Fitzgerald didn't go there, but it sure makes a lot of sense to me as you look at a company saying, well, how are we going to figure out where our loads are coming from if Silver Bay is under attack? And I think that's a big point for why they decided to go to Burlington. These are the world's tallest iron ore docks. And it turns out you could, when they were first built, load 15 at one time at these locks, these docks. Incredible facility, all gravity fed. They would actually bring it down from the mines and store it. And they bring it out here, and as it came out onto the dock, the Fitz would have loaded on this side. There was actually a scale in there, but it broke. So we really don't know how much Fitzgerald had on there, but each of these pockets hold a certain tonnage. So it's not like they were that far off of what the actual number was, but we know the scale was broke. We know that they were taking it directly from the carts. At one point, they moved it in, and the Fitzgerald is so long, they had to move it. So the part of the delay is the first mate has to offload any water that's in the ship. Remember, the ballast tanks of a ship are designed, the Fitzgerald, when it would come back up from Toledo, was so high in the water, the winds would catch it, it was hard to steer, and the propeller wouldn't work very well. So you pump water into the tanks, the ballast tanks, and lower the ship down. That allows it to be more efficient through the water. Well, they pull up here and start throwing cargo into it. You got to get rid of that water. And there was a 1 hour delay that has never been explained to me on why the Fitzgerald didn't get their cargo out in time. And the dock guy didn't even, he said, well, it just happens. He didn't even say why there'd be a problem. It probably wasn't anything significant to the wreck, but I'd love to know. So they move it 12 feet, and then they fill the rest of the hatches. They top it off, and they watch their loading lights to make sure it's level. It's always loaded heavier in the stern so the propeller can work more efficiently. And they pull away from the dock. Sometimes Fitzgerald would get stuck pulling away from the dock. It's so heavy. Just amazing. Here's a quick blurb. When I was just up there, I filmed a new documentary for PBS called Final Run. We decided to update the Fitzgerald for air last 2 months ago on Detroit Public TV. And here's me telling you some smart stuff about the loading dock. The ore docks here at Superior, Wisconsin shipped out their billionth ton of ore in October of 1970, using a golden ore car to commemorate the tonnage. That was enough ore to create 500 million automobiles at the time, with 97,891 ships loaded here at the world's largest ore dock since 1892. This is also the place where Red Bergner was told, hey, get up there and get on board the ship. He had gotten off in September, and he had problems with his feet. He had a bone spur on there, and the doctor said, we'll do the surgery. So he went home to Nacogdoches, Texas, and they said, hey, we've got a temporary cook that's been on board, Bob Rafferty. He wants off. Will you come up? And he says, well, why don't you just let Rich Bishop stay on board? And he said, Bishop's got ulcers. He wants off too. Turns out Bishop Red Bergner looked at his family and said, should I go? And they said, no, don't go. So he stayed home. He goes, I got vacation time. I'm going to take it. And so he missed that call. If you know the story of the Daniel J. Morrell, built right here in Bay City, sank in 1966, the cook got a bad head cold in the Sioux and got off too. So very interesting how those two famous shipwrecks, the largest on Lake Huron and largest on Lake Superior, both didn't have their cooks on board at that time. So Red says, no, I'm not going to go. Rafferty is stuck. He's going to stay. And that starts to change another one of our Gordon Lightfoot lyrics that we're going to talk about in a minute. But first, Fitz left fully loaded for Cleveland. We know the song. No, maybe Cleveland because the shipping company, Ogilvy Norton, which owned Columbia, is from Cleveland. We can kind of make that stretch. But it wasn't fully loaded. It was going to Zug Island in Detroit with National Steel, where they would build cars. In fact, Fitzgerald is so big, they could build 1,000 cars out of one load. So think about the average car dealership in 1975 was selling 1,000 cars a year, one load with the Edmund Fitzgerald, and they could cover that steel. So not fully loaded for at all. It was 3/4 loaded because if it was fully loaded, it would run aground in Zug Island. So Fitzgerald could not have carried 30,000 plus tons into the river system. It wouldn't have worked. So it's not fully loaded, not for Cleveland, but everybody tells me, Rick, Zug Island doesn't rhyme at all. And I argue, Cleveland doesn't rhyme at all. This is the operation at Zug. This is not the Hewletts that we're used to, these big, huge clamshells that these guys would ride inside and it'd come down and scoop out the cargo in 10-ton sections. This was a crane system, and most of the damage that I see from the Fitzgerald, it had 21 hatch covers. The majority of the damage came from this dock in Detroit. They tore it up. These big cranes would dump this thing down and it would hit the coamings. And remember, these are the water tightness. So if there's a big storm, water will come in. And there was damage from 1975, the year the Fitz went down, from the docks. So literally there are problems that came out of here and hatch problems that weren't addressed, didn't have time to address them until they were going to go into dry dock after the season. This is how Gordon got a lot of stuff wrong. This is Newsweek magazine. It says the cruelest month right here. And if you look in the article, it just surprised me because it says, according to the legend of the Chippewa tribe, Gitchagumi never gives up its dead. There's so many pieces in here about, and in the stone, the Mariners Church in downtown Detroit, the minister offered prayers. Where do you think Gordon got those gorgeous lyrics from? I mean, it's straight from here. But where did these guys get the article? These two guys are from Detroit. And I start to dig, and if you start to look into Havinghurst, how many people have read Walter Havinghurst's book on the Great Lakes? Go to your library. You should spend equal amounts of time at this museum and the library at all times. Get Havinghurst's book, and he talks about the Chippewa legend. And we're going to talk about the Chippewa legend in a second. Here's the route they're going to take. Typically, they would go up and they'd cut across the Keweenaw and make a straight beeline for Whitefish Point through the Sioux Locks, go down the St. Mary's, and then make their way through Lake Huron. But as they came out of here, there was a forecast, and the forecast was small craft advisories and going to build to bigger storms. So when this ship, the Arthur M. Anderson, left out of the dock, they came out of two harbors right here. They came up here and they had to make a decision. Are we going to go more northerly? Now, the winds would be coming out here. First, they'd start from the northeast down here, and then they'd move over to the northwest as that low pressure system was going to come up from Oklahoma and go right over Marquette and run into Canada. But how long would it take to cross this? And this is where captains have to use their experience to say, I think we'll make it. And the Fitzgerald decided we're not going to go all across Keweenaw. We're going to go up to the top where the winds can't build high enough. One of my friends called that the scenic route because they could see more of Canada at that point. So they went around, got up to there, and they had a couple of options. They could have stopped at Isle Royal, where even the 800-foot Blau was decided, we're not going to go into the storm, we're going to stay here. They could have stayed down in the river system. That's actually where the biggest ship on the Great Lakes, the very first 1,000-footer was. But there's also several vessels, including the Clay Ford and the Roche at Whitefish Bay. But they decided, no, we're going to keep going. And they got all the way up. They could have stopped at the Slate Islands at the very top. They decided, no, we're going to keep going, again, looking at the forecast. And as the storm front actually came, this is the actual plot from Captain Cooper on board the Anderson. I put in the states behind it because the facsimile was so bad in '76 when they did a copy of it. I put the states as close as I could, and I bled a little bit, but it's pretty close. You see he's got the storm front coming right over the Sioux. It actually was farther to the left, but his forecast was fairly accurate. He just misjudged how long it would take. It was faster by his own admission going across the lake, and that's why they got caught at the very worst place you could be when the northwest winds came out, and that was trying to make Whitefish Point or Crisp Point. That's where the winds were going to be the worst. This is the Weather Service Bureau's reports, and if you look in there, on the top is just Lake Superior storms. Who had the biggest storms, where they were, and what time they were. This is just 1975, the year the Fitzgerald was out. Fitzgerald 1, 2, 3 times on there, and then on the overall lakes, you can count Fitz in for 2 more on Lake Huron, trying to make it in. So Fitzgerald never backed away from a storm, and that was pushed out by especially the cook, who said he sat on the stern of the Fitzgerald and actually told the owners, we were going to rip the cover off the lifeboat, and we said this captain's going to sink us eventually. And the company just looked at him and said, it's $500 fine if you take the cover off the lifeboat. Interesting. So they pushed it. Here's the initial storm. You can see the Fitzgerald went higher. It was faster than the Anderson. Anderson that summer had been extended, so it was longer than Fitzgerald. The Fitzgerald actually turned very higher up by Otterhead. They could actually, people at Otterhead Lighthouse said they saw the lights. Anderson cut the corner to try to, cut in. Also tried to avoid the rolling that was now starting to happen. And we'll talk about Gordon saying supper wasn't going to come because of, they had every meal on board the Anderson. There was no problem with that. Here's the actual weather forecast showing that front going past Keweenaw, speeding up into Ontario there. And dawn came late. The breakfast had to wait. There's no indication that they didn't eat breakfast. In fact, the cook on board the Anderson said an egg never even rolled off his table. That's how well the captain kept the winds at his stern. Eventually, once you turn and start going down later in the afternoon, where we get problems and damage from the Fitzgerald, yes, there would have been some rolling, but dawn did not come late on board. The breakfast obviously did not wait. As they went down, you'd see the damage was listed here as they passed an area called 6 Fathom Shoal. I spend a lot of time in the book, an entire chapter, talking about 6 Fathom Shoal, to the point of, I hope there's 30 different things in my book that'll point you to that this ship never ran aground. The only thing that leads us to believe that is that Cooper himself looked at the radar and said, boy, she's closer in there than I'd want to be. And all the shipping companies took that as being Captain McSorley messed up. Now remember, on board, McSorley had been through there in storms many times. McCarthy, his first mate, was a captain. They had radio beacons that were working until they passed, beacons at Caribou, beacons at Whitefish. Navigational error that far, and then the Coast Guard said there was almost 30 minutes it would have taken for them to go anywhere close to here. But they were worried about this area on the map called 6 Fathoms because that's where they said they would have run aground. Cooper told his crew, don't go in this area, it's too dangerous. Well, it turns out that was a misnomer, that the water's actually deeper than it is. It was actually 2 fathoms deeper, which probably wouldn't make much difference in the rolling seas there, but I don't believe it. But look at the damage there, and let's have, this is Cooper's actual map that he shared with the captains where he thought it was, but again, the Coast Guard didn't believe that he could have made that distance. Let's let the captain tell us a little bit about that area.
Well, he called me up, that was 3:10 in the afternoon. And he said, I've got a little problem. He said, my fence rail is down. He said, I've got 2 vents missing, and I've taken a starboard list. Now, that immediate list, again, tells me that he either had a stress fracture or he bottomed out. He said he had his pumps on. I asked him if he had his pumps on. He said yes. But he said later on, he said that he wasn't gaining anything by pumping out on it, so the water was coming in the hull as fast as they were pumping it out. Those were 2 big pumps that he had on there. So the fracture or the stress fracture or him bottoming out had to happen at that time. And from that time on, he was sinking.
Well, this guy, obviously a hero. He's the one that turned around to go look when the other ship said, no, we're not going to go. So obviously a hero. But he is wrong in a couple things. He said a starboard list. In his initial interviews, he came out and said, I don't know what side it was. The captain never said which one. So, but this is now 10 years, 20 years afterwards that he did the TV interview and started to add details. And many of the survivors I've interviewed, and as you know, I've done probably more interviews with survivors, the stories get to change as they learn things through newspapers and the Coast Guard report and such. We don't know that it was leaning to starboard. It makes the most sense that she would have been leaning to starboard because that would have allowed boarding seas to come up. Remember, a giant wave hit the Anderson, damaged their lifeboat on the opposite side, the lee side, away from the winds. So that wave jumped over the Anderson 30 feet high and smashed that lifeboat down and destroyed it. Then it sped in front of the ship because the ship's only going 13, 14 miles an hour. The wave's probably doing 30 miles an hour from the pushing of 70-mile-an-hour winds. It speeds in front, and at 7:10 it hits Fitzgerald and it vanishes from the radar. The lights go out as fast as that, and there's a snow squall that blinds everybody from knowing exactly what happened. The captain wired in, he had water coming in. No, he never said, he said he had his pumps going, but that makes sense that they would say water coming in. And the good ship and crew were in peril. Is Gordon saying that the captain said they're in peril? If he is, they never did. There was never a mayday. There was never a time where he said, hey, you know, our ship's going down. The last report they had, and as Cooper talks, he said, you know, he'd been up all night, and as they passed Caribou, Cooper said, I'm exhausted. I've been up all night. I'm going to go take a nap. Would a captain take a nap if he thought the Fitzgerald would run aground? Yeah. So he went down, took a nap, and he was, you know, totally within his right. He had Morgan Clark in the pilot house taking care of things. Morgan was the last one to do the conversations with the Fitzgerald. And the last transmission was when the radars were out. The Fitzgerald had 2 radars. One was operating at low, they couldn't get very many miles out of it. And the other one was completely gone. They had known that there were saltwater vessels that were sitting at the point that were going to go out into the storm. Now the storm is coming out of the northwest at this point. So these saltwater vessels, like, it'll be right off our nose. We'll just plow into it. They only made like 1 mile an hour going into this. And they had American captains on board these saltwater vessels as part of our law that we have to make sure that they've got qualified people on deck. So they're going through, and at that point, you know, that's when the radio traffic starts coming in and the storms come up, and Fitzgerald knows that those saltwater vessels are getting into this snow squall. So they call Anderson and say, is this traffic going to hit us? And Morgan Clark looks and he goes, no, it's no factor. He goes, how are you guys holding out with your problems? And the last report from the Fitz is, we're holding our own. So that means everything's going okay, we're making it. And then that's the last transmission, so we don't know what happened after that. Here's where we see that 6 p.m. wave that hit the Anderson. By 7 p.m. it easily hit the Fitzgerald. It's in a snow squall. It comes up, it crushes the first hatch and the 5th hatch in, folds it in, pushes its nose underneath, and all the other hatches start blowing off. I found them folded on the bottom from the air pressure trying to escape from the Fitzgerald. The big question is, and we'll take a look at some video to try to bear this out, is did it go down in one piece? Did it break on the surface? And no one has really answered that yet. When supper time came, the old cook came on deck saying, fellas, it's too rough to feed you. The old cook wasn't on board. Now, Rafferty was not a young spring chicken. He was talking about, you know, going to retire, so he was definitely at his end. His daughter is the most magnificent woman, Pam. I've seen her at a couple different lectures. We did one in Duluth, and she hates peas and carrots. And so every time I'd turn away, she would scoop her peas and carrots onto my plate, which, God bless her. The woman's so incredible. This is Bob right here. This is Bob. The only thing that Pam has from her dad is that cookbook. And I told her, I said, man, I'd love to get a picture of that cookbook sometime. And she goes, oh, don't worry. She UPS's it to me. The only keepsake from her dad, and she trusts it to the guys in the brown suit. Thank God they did a fantastic job. And for record, I've never lost a package through UPS. So, but that is the actual cookbook where many of his menus, many of his recipes would have come from. This is the real old cook, George Bergner, but Bob certainly went down in history as the cook that was lost on board. So would he have said it's too rough to feed you? Probably not. I don't see for a second that happened. It was a good alliteration. I think it makes it sad, but I don't think that it was really literally that way. But I want to play one more interview for you.
Well, the keel is the main angle going down the middle of the ship, eh? So everything is welded to that. The bottom, everything. Your frames going around, you know, and uprights, all of that stuff is welded to the cargo hole or to the bottom of the ship, inside bottom. The keel was loose.
He actually wintered the ship, so his job was to be to sit on board and make sure the pipes don't freeze. He'd go through, and when it's sitting at Superior, Wisconsin, or Superior, Wisconsin, at Fraser Shipyard, his job would be to winter there. He lived up there. That's where his hometown was originally. And he said when they came in to put the bow thrusters in, he saw that the keel was loose. There was welding rods that they shoved inside there and put a bead over the top of it. The Coast Guard knew all about this, and I cover it again in the book. I've got drawings of the keel replacements that they've done, the official records from the actual company. The question is, did it keep happening? And Red said at one time, the captain looked at him, he says, keel is loose again, skipper, and he goes, hey, I don't care. I got one more trip and I'm retiring, I'm done. So if that's true, I don't know, but that's what he said. Another thing I've always wondered, this is a painting by Dave Conklin, who's an amazing artist. He does all of Whitefish Point's work, and it really for the Fitzgerald he did, because they also got to work with another great one that did all the Titanic stuff as well for the other ones. But Conklin's painting, Every Man Knew, is very, very close to how I think it sank. The waves are kind of in the wrong place for the way it would happen, I think, but I think they wanted to show that deck. I think it went up onto the top of that mid-deck, and when I saw the back, you see the decks going up from the Fitzgerald. I think my little laser went out, yeah. The first one would be the cruise, and the second one would be the lounge. Also the captain's office is up there, and then the top, the Texas deck, would be the pilot house. So that deck below the pilot house are the lounge windows, and those are all blown inward from this wave that hit. The first hatch is folded, and I'll show you a video of it. The fifth hatch is folded. So that wave would have come up, pushed her nose underneath, and at that point, I believe it tore it into pieces before it hit the bottom. And we'll share a little bit more of why that is. This is called Every Man Knew, and Cooper was asked, would every guy know? What would you tell if you're the captain? And this is super sobering to hear him say this.
You just can't panic the crew. You got to keep your mouth shut. You got to work around that somehow. And I like every other captain, I think you think your ship is infallible. I think he thought that ship was going to get him down. I know I thought that way about the Anderson. I didn't think anything. I thought she was indestructible. But I think Captain McSorley felt the same way. You know, he said, well, I'm only 14 miles from Whitefish Point. He said, I've got it made. That's just about what he would be saying. But his last alternative before that was to go in and put her aground at Caribou. That would have been his only other alternative at the time. And he probably would have if he knew what was going to happen.
That's key when he says, my ship was infallible. It wouldn't sink. He believed that in his heart, that this ship will never let him down. And unfortunately, we have 5,000 shipwrecks on the bottom, I think, with many captains that believe that there's no way that they do, it would fail them. Parisian Island's right in the middle there. That's where Cooper finally made it through. He looks at his radar, it blots out. He gets up from, a quick nap, which I'm sure wasn't very thorough, jumps up, comes in, hears the traffic, and looks at the radar, and there's a big blot over the radar where the Fitz should be. The snow is blinding them, they can't see, and it vanishes. So he tries for a half hour to raise the Coast Guard. They had a power failure at the Sioux, so the main command center's out. They finally come back up, and now he's trying to convince them there's a 700-foot freighter and 29 guys missing. The Coast Guard's saying, hey, be on the lookout. There's 6 fishermen out there in a 16-foot boat, and they were on this island right out here. They were on Tequamanon Island, and they made it through, thank God. Barely, holding the door of their shelter shut in the book. And if you go around the Parisian Island, that's where Cooper finally got his respite. The storm stopped because now the winds are broken by the island there, so he could hide and wait it out. Or even with the coverage he had there, he could probably make it to the Sioux. But the Coast Guard called him up and said, hey, we don't have a ship to go look for this Fitzgerald you say is missing. We scrambled the Woodrush. It's in Duluth. It'll be 20 hours. You're our only hope. Will you go? And he says, call the saltwater guys. They're going out there. And the saltwater guys asked the captains, and the captain said, no, we've got stern, cabins in the back that are so high, we can't turn in this wind. We're going to go straight. If we see something, we'll tell you, but we're not going to. The Roush is in there, and it says, no, our radar, I looked at it, it's too much damage. We're not going to go. My men would be in peril. And again, that's not cowardice, that's genius. Your job is to protect your men first and your ship first. So that's his job to do that. The Anderson kind of hemmed and hawed for a half hour. They said, we don't know. Finally, they decided to go out there, and they met the Fitzgerald out there. And I'm not taking anything away from the skipper. He's an amazing man, or was. He passed away. But the first one to go back after much prodding, was our buddy who was hiding back here, Captain Cooper, on board the Anderson. Here's the conversation that actually took place between the Coast Guard and Captain Cooper.
Arthur and Madison, Goose 16, 22. On 22. Madison, this is Goose 2. This is Goose 2. I understand you had him visually and on the radar, and you lost him in both respects. I asked him how he was making out with his problem. He said he lost those vents and he had a lift, and he said he was holding his own. The last time I talked with him, he said he was holding his own, and that's the last time I lost contact after that. This is Super Control, Roger. We have it. Do you think there's any possibility that you could come about and go back there and do any searching? Over. Oh, God, I don't know. The sea out there is tremendously large, and if you want me to, I can, but I'm not going to be making any time. I'll be lucky to make 2 or 3 miles an hour going back out that way. Hello, Control. You realize what the conditions are out there, don't you? This is Control. Affirmative. From what your reports are, I can appreciate the conditions. Again, though, I have to leave that decision up to you as to whether you'll be hazarding your vessel or not. If you think you can safely go back into the area, I would request that you do so, but I have to leave that decision up to you. Over. I'll go out and take a look, but I know when I was about 15 miles above Whitefish, we took a sea right over the top of the hatch crane up here, and that's 8 feet up in the water, too, so I don't know whether I can do it or not. I'll give it a try, but that's all I can do.
You can see the hesitancy, and again, it's going back into that storm. When I started doing my research into this, I especially found out that really they asked the shipping company, send us everything you've got on the repairs of the Fitzgerald, and they started sending them even the requisition forms for what type of coffee they drink on the Fitzgerald. Hills Brothers, by the way. It's unbelievable minutia, but it starts to add things that we just didn't know, and that's where I started to realize there's a lot of information to make a new book. The stool that they found, this was picked up by the Roche, who did find one of the lifeboats too, as they were heading for Marquette with coal, and as soon as they offloaded their coal, they came right back to the Sioux and brought those materials back. Look at that oily stool. It's completely covered with bunker fuel. This is the fuel oil from the Fitzgerald. And obviously from the Fitz. The question is it from the pilot house? Because here's the requisition form that the Coast Guard was given for a one pilot house stool, approximately 30 inches tall, with Ernest McSorley's signature on it. So these are the things that start to add that flavor to it. We've seen these images forever. We think about the damage of not only this lifeboat, this was the one that was picked up by the fish tug James D. #2, but the one that's ripped completely in half. Did it go through the propeller? Why is it, torn in half? We have so many questions. The legend lives on from the Chippewa on down. This caught me too. I thought, we've got so many great accounts from people, especially Henry Schoolcraft, that came in and logged out many of the Native American stories. There's got to be a Chippewa legend here, right? I mean, it was in Gordon Lightfoot's song. I looked and I looked. There's not a single legend from the Chippewa that I know of that talks about Lake Superior, Gitchagumi giving up its dead. But I did find out 150 years before we really started to see it on the Great Lakes, Lake Tahoe was the lake that never gives up its dead. It's too cold. And as I searched using a power search of give up its dead or lake that never gives up its dead, you start to turn up that in Wyoming when a banker died. And again, this is all 100 years before we start to see stuff attributed to Lake Superior on the lake. The dark lake never gives up its dead. It's too cold. And the stories, the Indians have a legend that the lake never gives up its dead. This is where it's starting to build from. This guy brought it to the Great Lakes. He's on board a freighter. Wilkinson is going along, and the first mate comes out and says, here, take a bucket of this water. And he brings it up from Lake Superior, and they drink it. It's so cold. And Wilkinson says, man, that's freezing. He goes, yeah, so you fall overboard. We're not going to stop for you. And he goes, why not? He said, because the lake is so cold, it'll never give up its dead. We'll never find you. The bacteria in your body won't, expand and allow you to float. This then turned into a series of newspapers, including St. Nicholas Magazine, that we start seeing. It's attributed to a captain now who says that, the lake will never give up its dead. And then when the Bannockburn went down, we see that. The Adela Shores, which was loaded with salt from Ludington, went down, and we just found it off of Whitefish Point, Chris Point, going towards Grand Marais in deep water. That was also attributed to the reason the crew never showed was because the lake never gives up its dead. They did find several bodies from there, but so that's where that kind of comes from. I also saw through all my research that I never realized how they found the Fitzgerald. How did they go in this area between Chris Point? The last point was about 10 miles offshore, 12 miles offshore was reported, all the way to literally into the harbor system, into Canada. So they called up this squadron of submarine finding aircraft, and they flew out there and they found it. But once they found it, the buoy was placed down, and the next night a storm took it and they lost it. So they had to call these guys back up. And I know this because in the book you'll see all these, there's 4 guys that I found that were on these missions that talk about it. And think about this. Their job is to find Russian submarines in 1975, right? The big stinger on the tail is a magnetic detector. They can see changes in the Earth's magnetic field. And that means finding a big submarine underwater would be pretty easy. The submarine that they had at the time was only 456 feet. This is the biggest Soviet submarine we would have looked for. So what happens when you fly over a 700-foot-long freighter with all that taconite out? They said they made one pass and the needle went wham! They knew exactly where it was in one pass. It was not that difficult. They narrowed it down. You can see in the graphic I threw the wood rush there. The wood rush was on scene. They came through and actually found it. And Bob Cutsleeve looks at the sonar. They drag a fish across the top of it, and he looks at the stern. He goes, look at both sections here are in 2 pieces, and they're both upright. And his underling, other tech that was there, looked at one of the investigators that was there. His name's Jim Wilson. And he says, I don't think so. That looks like that's the propeller right there. And Bob looks at him and goes, he's young. He doesn't understand. He doesn't know the ways of the world. So they draw the pictures with the smokestack upright. This is what was in the paper. This is what it looks like. And they brought the Curve 3 underwater robot down to take a peek at it. And it was upside down. So Cutsleeve in the Free Press, it says he was red-faced. So obviously, when it first saw it, the Coast Guard told me they thought that the robot had turned upside down. They couldn't believe that the stern was upside down. And in the audio that I actually found from the Coast Guard, exploring in the van on board Wood Rush, you hear him go, so it's it's upside down, huh? You can hear him kind of chiding the guy in the background, which is fun. Those audio tapes were huge in my book. I wanted to make sure that I added in that kind of, seasonings, if you will, to the story that we've never heard on board. I've certainly shared the interviews with Captain Wilson of what it was like, but you guys want to take a listen into the van real quick? This is them going over the first hatch and discovering the first hatch.
Seem to be inside the combing. There's the number 1.
It's painted on the side.
That is number 1. That's the forward end of the hatch.
That's the forward end of the first hatch combing.
That is positive.
Winches in the background. Right on the center line.
Right on the center line. She's looking starboard forward. This view.
That's looking starboard forward.
That's an important picture. That's a very important.
It's an important picture.
Hear the camera clicking, taking pictures. Hundreds.
That was picture 274.
Most of those pictures
There's
are
the
gone
corner.
now. The footage is pretty much decayed.
And it looks as if it's down into the combing.
They're coming over the edge now.
Close up with one of those dogs and see if you can clamp and pull out of it. Possible. There it is. Shoot that. Number 1. How about that?
There it is. Hatch cover number 1. Down into the combing. Force of the impact turned it over and
They
pushed
think
it
the
right
force
down
of the
into hatch.
impact is what caused that to cave in. There's no way that happened that way. They also saw the clamps on there. The ones in the background still look like Kessner clamps or like C clamps, and those go across, and there's 69 of them, I believe, on each one of the 21 hatches on the Fitzgerald, and those are used to squeeze down and tighten on the gasket so there's no leakage. This one in front is distorted. You see it? Those are the ones that they believe are dogged down, and the cover, when it launched, destroyed those actual clamps on there, and that's why the attention was spent right away on that. Sailors always tell me they never ever sail without dogging all those down. The film footage I got from the captain had the bird sitting on the hatch clamp, and there's a lot of shots of them in storms with the hatch clamps not all dogged down. So is it their fault? It's not their fault. Again, I don't think it was the hatch clamps, but for people to tell me over and over and over again, they wouldn't have made that mistake. That's like saying, yeah, I always wear my seatbelt. It's not, I mean, clearly in the film footage, they're in the storms, they did roll that way. But why was there such pushback? Why did everybody want it to be Captain McSorley ran over the part of the rocks north of Caribou and it sank? It's because it was better for the shipping company, because the Coast Guard was already saying, hey, if those hatches do leak, you can't carry that much cargo in the wintertime anymore. Billions of dollars would be lost. Then they said, you didn't have watertight bulkheads in the ships? We want to change all those ships and make them all watertight with the centers all sectioned out so that if we do have a catastrophe like this, and the shipping company said, oh, no, we're pushing back on that. He made a mistake. He ran it aground. Listen to what Jim Wilson says. This is the Coast Guard investigator.
If the cause of the loss was something the company knew about or should have known about, then there's no limitation on liability, because they should have corrected it, or should have found it and correct. If it's a third-party error, then it shifts to the third party, which wasn't, even involved in this one, third-party error. But so that makes the nicest thing in the world from a liability standpoint is running aground. And the worst thing that can happen is defective hatches or hatch clamps. And that's where all this furrow.
Jim Wilson, first of all, an amazing guy, and 3-hour interview. I've probably had the most time with him in an interview. Surprises me by showing up in Royal Oak when I do a lecture. This is 2 years ago. I'm doing a big PBS thing. It's like you're doing a talk, and I know my friend that's on the rock and roll interviews, and especially the incredible history we have here at the museum on music from Michigan and such. It'd be like doing a talk on Elvis or something and having, Priscilla Presley being in the audience, and here I get done spewing all my knowledge, and I said, any questions? And here this guy stands up, and I didn't recognize him at first, and I realized it's him. I'm like, oh, I've screwed up. But he was so gracious, and this little kid came up to me, wanted my autograph. I said, go get his autograph. Jim passed away just 2 months after that, so it's just such a catch. For not only for me to tell him how much I appreciate it and how much he plays a part in these lectures, but for that kid, just a highlight of that young man's life to be able to meet them. Let's go over the hatch real quick. This is the starboard side of the Fitzgerald. You can tell that this is very early footage. The life raft on top was taken off in '70. They moved to an inflatable raft that was actually on the right-hand side, the starboard side. You can't see any of the bow thruster stern or the stack that's right there. Look for right here, the rail that the hatch crane rode on, and this bumper that stops it. Watch for that. Look at the deck above the gentleman that's on the winches, and see that pole that goes there. That's the bosun's chair. So when you get to the Sulaks, they swing you over. We'll watch for that. See the deck that's above there, the forecastle deck? See how nice and straight it is? Watch what the impact of the bottom did, and then watch for the cover of hatch number 1 as we go across. Let's put it in motion. You can already see the deck is distorted. Look at how crooked it is at the very top. That S should be straight. Here's that bumper. The rail is buried. Here's hatch number 1 that the Coast Guard saw. It's painted right there. You can see going over, look at it folded in there. Where's the cargo? If the ship went nose like this, 26,000 tons of taconite should have come forward, and that hatch is at least 12 feet into the coaming. Behind this in hatch 2, Clelia actually descended into the hatch and didn't realize it until they'd followed their anchor line down right into the ship. Where's the cargo? It should have piled forward on all of this. We're going across now those winches. You can see they're mashed down. The builder's plates in the upper right-hand corner, it says Great Lakes Engineering Detroit. This is ripped away, the spar deck, ripped away from the side of the ship. Where's the cargo? Why isn't it in here? We should see all kinds of taconite here. If it hit like that, impact on the bottom and split open, where did it go? That's what's leading me more and more to believe it ripped on the surface. I also went all the way around the back side of this. I spent an hour and a half, went all the way around the back. This is level with the ground here, so we didn't even know we were on the Fitzgerald until we got up to the second hatch. You can see how buried it is right here, and it falls off to the bow, where the nose of the ship is actually bent 90 degrees from the impact of the bottom. It's all chipped away, flaked away from the plating breaking and the paint finally letting go. But in the back section, there's no cargo back there. There's not a single taconite pellet that I saw inside there. Did it not break on the surface and go down in the stern section? If you look at the top of this deck, it's ripped up. It would have pushed and then flipped over. Here we can see some of that. We've got the tear right here. This is the original Coast Guard drawing right here, and you can see a lot of problems wrong with it. It doesn't show any of the damage to the forecastle deck. It doesn't show, and the guy that drew this, Rick Sullivan, didn't have a lot to go on. I mean, he had black and white footage and horrible pictures of just, where we think we are, so he couldn't really place it all together. But I went all the way back here. There's actually hatch combings back here. I don't see any of that mounding that they're showing there at all. Nothing like that. I did see a ladder inside where that crack is. This is Jim Clary's drawing. This is literally from our expedition, 16 hours of footage. You see a lot more of the detail that goes in there that shows, even in the dented in lounge windows, you can see inside there as well. So what happened? What was that structural problem with the ship that every sailor seemed to know about? Did McSorley know about it? This guy was a relief third mate, Dick Orgel, who was huge in the court cases, and I'll talk about him in just a second.
Slamming into like a 10-foot wave. Now that, not that much of a wave, And you could, then you could look aft from over the chart table and see that just go down the deck. It was like if you had a runner, like a rug, and you would flip it. It's similar to that. But it did it so much, I said to him, that couldn't pop off them clamps, No. He said, I never heard of that. So anyway, I said, boy, she does bend a lot for a 10-foot sea. And he was going to his room and he said, sometimes it scares me.
That's scary coming from a captain. Dick Orgel, if you look at the headlines from the investigation by the Coast Guard, #1 witness. And it was weird because they came out before he even testified. And I started to think, that reporter in me again, why is that so? Well, you dig deeper and you find out that the attorneys are the ones that found him. So here the attorney's like, well, we don't really want this to go to court. So if we find somebody that says that ship is a problem and we put him out in front of the media, then all of a sudden you start seeing in the interviews, it says Dick Orgel is talking, and then the maritime attorney says, I hope the Coast Guard want to interview him. So they finally relent and they do interview him. But this is a complete play, in my estimation, to try to get a settlement. And they did very quickly after this came out, so it kind of makes sense. At 7 p.m., a main hatchway caved in. Totally legit. I showed you 2 main hatchways that went down. I wouldn't call it a main hatchway, but again, Gordon gets that. The problem is in 2010, he watched a Canadian documentary, and I met the Fletchers who made it. It's a fantastic documentary. It's based on a whole bunch of simulations that they said it probably wasn't the hatches. They've never dove the Fitzgerald. They've never seen what I've seen. And I was at a lecture, and I let them have it with what I saw. I said it absolutely was the hatches, and I've got photographic proof that it was hatches. But Gordon saw it, and because the families came to see him quite often, at the concerts, he invited them to come backstage. They would tell him, my son died. And Ruth Hudson being especially one of the poor lady lost her teenage son. Bruce was very young at the time, just after his teenage years, but brand new on the ship. And I can't imagine what that loss is, but that doesn't change the story. And it's not his fault if they didn't dog the hatches. The first mate's the one that makes that call. And ultimately, in the book, we talk about the captain putting the foot down on overtime. He said to the cook, "I'm calling the office on you. No more overtime. Stop it." Well, Red knew the office pretty well, and he would call them and work it out. So we know that there was some, the pushback on overtime. They left on a Sunday. They didn't get all the hatches down. That's not Bruce's fault that it wasn't done that way. But to pretend when he changed the song, I said, well, why didn't he change Fully Loaded for Cleveland? Why didn't he change all these things that didn't make any sense, but only change this one? And so when we do Storm concerts, I have Dan sing the original because I think it's more to it. Here's Captain Wilson as he's looking at the debris that's down there. The guy wearing the actual Canadian transport stuff is actually, I think, Barrow. He's the actual lead investigator, the Admiral. And I'm surprised, maybe they ran out of overalls and he was wearing one from them. Here's the lifeboat number 1 that was actually first viewed by the Arthur M. Anderson. It was picked up by the Roush, cut directly in half, and we still don't know why. But there's some interesting clues here. You see that rope that's in the center? That's actually a knotted line, so you've got something to pull yourself to the boat if you can when you're there. That knotted line, I found another one draped over the stern of the Fitzgerald. Is it possible, and I don't think it's long enough to do this, so I'd have to do more research, and it could also be the knotted line could be a lead line where they actually could measure if they lost. The Edmund Fitzgerald didn't have a fathometer on board. It couldn't tell how deep the water was. They would use a knotted line with a weight on it to see how deep the water would be if they had to. So it could be that too, but that's very interesting. If it's around the stern, that's how it got cut in half. The musty old church in Detroit, boy, was Mariners Church ticked off when that came out. Gorton came to the church and it stopped right then. He stopped singing Musty Old Church. And the story of Mariners Church is so amazing. It doesn't look musty at all inside. It's an amazing tribute every year that they do for the sailors that were on board, and especially for all the sailors. There's been 25,000 people who lost their lives that don't get a song by Gordon Lightfoot, that we should remember all the time. This church actually was pretty mobile. Did you know that? This church was actually, in the left-hand side, you can see it was on the other side of Detroit. And with all the expansion they were doing, they decided to move it. So in 1954, they picked it up, and you can see the trucks, and they rolled the entire church all the way downtown. Life magazine actually did a spread on it. It was so cool to get it over there. A very neat area.
Only a handful of explorers have gained permission to dive the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, located over 500 feet down in Lake Superior's icy water. In 1976, the Coast Guard lowered the Curve 3, a special remote-operated vehicle that could record video and snap pictures. It revealed that the Fitz was ripped into 2 main sections, the bow upright, the stern upside down. In 1980, Jacques Cousteau's team were the first humans to dive down to the wreck, exploring the bow section and reporting extensive damage that they believed was caused by a surface breakup. 9 years later, Whitefish Point led a team with a 3D camera to explore the site remotely. An open door was found in the pilot house, leading some to believe it was an escape attempt as the Fitz made its final plunge. In 1994, submersibles again visited the wreck. In early July, Harbor Branch Oceanographic sent several teams down in the Clelia, and only a few weeks later, the Delta looked for clues. At the end of the first day of diving, the Delta subcrew found a sailor's body lying on the lake bottom near the bow section.
So quiet and dark down there. It reminds me of a church, is knowing that God's down there.
It's quiet where they sleep, no more the tempest roar.
Headlines were quick to admonish the team, and the state of Michigan passed a law banning the use of footage taken. A final dive with the Canadian Navy removed the ship's bell, and many family members of the lost crew called for a ban on diving the Edmund Fitzgerald. A later deepwater sonar scan revealed what appeared to be substantial damage to the spar deck of the Fitz, a teasing clue to a shipwreck that still largely remains a mystery some 40 years later.
40 years, you hear Dan's voice there. We can't wait to do another Storm. We're talking about doing a concert coming up, a 2-hour concert. We're definitely going to be with tall ships, which I'm super excited about. This is a painting that Jim Clary did of the overall view of on the bottom. The center is actually dropping a plaque, and on that plaque has the name of all the crew. This is the first time, this is before the bell came down. This is the first time the crew were memorialized on a plaque. And at the very bottom of that is the name of the crew. So my name humbly is on the bottom. And this is just after the 10th hatch. on the Edmund Fitzgerald, which is very sobering. This is that weird sonar trace that's showing like the deck's all collapsed. You can't see anything from hatches 1 and 2. There's a lot of detail that's out of place in this, so I don't believe it to be accurate. As soon as the marine sonic sonar went over, the family said no more sonar. So we haven't looked at this in over 10 years, and we're hoping that eventually we'll get a better look to really see if that damage happened. I'd put money on the fact that it didn't. So how did the song do? I got to show you this is Disco Duck, okay, which was chasing Edmund Fitzgerald, just like sadly the loss of the Fitz with the Anderson. The blue line is the Edmund Fitzgerald song. Look what happens as we get to November. When everybody starts talking about the gales of November, the Fitzgerald shoots up the charts and goes to number 2. It can't get past number 1, where Disco Duck by Rick Dees and his cast of idiots actually made it to number 1. They stalled at 2 because Rod Stewart's Tonight the Night it was on there and could not get past it. And it plummeted right after as soon as the holiday came in, the song was off the charts. Not Corden's biggest song. He actually had one that was bigger. I think Carefree Highway actually went higher. The biggest money I think he made, though, was on If You Could Read My Mind. I think even Elvis covered that one, which is pretty incredible. Why make a book? I had all this detail, everything that came in. I was told when I went that Fred Shannon, who led our expedition, was going to write a book. That's why everybody was upset about the body. Was it going to be in the book? What's going to happen to this footage? And I was perfectly content with that. And we went decades afterwards and nothing happened. And sadly, Fred just passed away in November. So that book, even though I know there was a draft, a friend of mine read it, I knew it wasn't going to happen. And the story of what was really happening, not only for all of the interviews that I've shared with you tonight, plus a bunch more, but the behind the scenes of Expedition 94 needs to be told, because it wasn't a bunch of guys looking for bodies. That's not what we were doing. And anybody who's been here to hear a talk from me knows that that's not what I'm all about. It's about finding these incredible history pieces and telling the story that's there, and especially for the ones that don't have a Gordon Lightfoot song to write, sing about it. So that's my charge, is to make sure that all of these stories are told. That's what I hope you'll find in 300 pages of this. More pictures than any other book, and certainly there's all kinds of backstories to the 89 expedition, where I could actually listen to what they were saying as they were diving and had power failures and stuff. Is it critical to how the ship sank? Not really, but I think what I point out, especially with the hatch covers, is new material that hasn't been released. That's what's important to me. And as people read it and feed back to me that it's maybe nearly as good as Fred Stonehouse's book, my mentor, the greatest writer of the Fitzgerald stories, that's good enough for me for sure. Here's where you can go to listen to my podcast. There's a 4-hour Edmund Fitzgerald one, shipwreckpodcast.com. I also have all of my tour information. It's on there as well, which I've never had a February like this. It's going to be a great year as things shape up, which is wonderful to know. Do you want to know what I'm also working on? This vessel. This is a drawing by Ed Pusick, and Ed and I had a very just distant, pen pal thing where I'd write to him and tell him how much his waves just, when I'd see his books and the Fred Stonehouse books especially, it was huge. This is a Bay City built ship called the Walter Vale, and it was lost at Munising. How many people have taken the Munising boat tour to see the shipwrecks there? That surprises me. If you get a chance, this glass bottom tour that's there, Pete Lindquist is the greatest Youper in the world. He speaks fluent Youper, and his family's involved. They just built a brand new boat up there. You go over the Vale, which is called the Herman Hetler, named for a lumber baron that's out of Chicago, and it broke up carrying a cargo of salt. So I've been going crazy, much to my poor wife's dismay. The last couple of days, probably weeks now, I've been studying the salt industry of Saginaw, which led the world, the Saginaw River area. It had blocks all across the river. This was lost hauling salt. The Adela Shores was lost hauling salt, which we just found and just got to explore. So this is what we're working on next. This will probably be the next time I chat with you here that we'll be talking about, and we'll share more about it. But I wanted to make sure you saw this. The rudder's down there and the boat passes right over. You'll also see there was an anchor down there. And of course, scuba divers in the 60s were taking anything they could find in shallow water. This ran on rocks, so it's not very deep. I mean, you can see it from a boat. The anchor was taken and brought to Negaunee as a lawn ornament for a while. And then the state said, hey, if you have anything from the underwater resources, that belongs to us, we're going to prosecute. So they gave an amnesty period to return these. So when they returned it, it was painted a beautiful blue color, which no one would ever have, but as the boats would go over, and especially as I dove it, you'd see this massive blue anchor. Well, of course, the water has certainly turned it back to the color of everything underwater, which is green underneath there, and it's a great tour. I hope you get to see it, and we'll certainly talk more about it. Is there any questions about what we've covered? Yeah, Don?
Yeah, you mentioned about the Fitzgerald and the Morel, about the people getting off. Well, there's also another famous one, was the Eber Ward that happened here.
Absolutely. Oh yeah, Eber Ward's story is amazing. It's a fantastic dive. It's over 130 feet deep. It's got huge mushroom anchors, and it's always a little spooky. Chuck Feltner found that wreck, and it's amazing to see the capstan covers and everything that have been recovered. If you go to the Straits of Mackinac, the museum there has not only incredible artifacts from the Straits area, but they also have some crazy video guy with me voicing the story. You'll love the stories of the Straits up there as well. Any other questions? Yes?
A little thumbnail sketch of how or why did the Fitz sink?
Why?
The gathering of water, too much water, bow went deep and it couldn't come back because of a wave, or?
Sure. Why did the Fitz sink in a nutshell? The big wave hit the Anderson. The question is, why didn't it sink the Anderson? Was it the Three Sisters? I don't think so. The Three Sisters theory that it's on a peak of a bunch of waves, the Anderson was much more susceptible to that. So why didn't the Anderson sink? That's more of the question that I have than why did that wave sink the Fitzgerald? So it wasn't big enough to take down the Anderson. Was it structural problems that happened? Probably. Was it the extra water coming on board? There was shipping a lot of water. Was it because of the hatches, as the Coast Guard alluded to? Remember, they never said there's a reason why it sank. They said probable cause because, again, none of us can really figure it out. I think big wave pushed it underneath before they could call for help, broke it into the stern section, rotating, ripping the bottom off, and the bow section stayed on course. It's still on that, 192 true for Chris Point is where it was headed for, and trying to get around Whitefish to where it would get shelter. The stern rotates and gets caught in that column of water because now it's not streamlining, gets pushed to the side, flips over, and sadly it ends in seconds. So that's what I think, and I don't think many people will argue. The question is, did it run aground? And I'll say no ship architect during the talk said, they said if it hit Caribou, it would have sunk at Caribou by the design. There's not a scrape on the bottom of the Edmund Fitzgerald. I saw it all on there. No, I can't find any reason other than Cooper, who's very viable, but he wasn't watching the Fitz. They weren't watching the radar at that time. That was well after they passed Caribou when they asked for that assistance. So no, I don't think it's a part of it at all. And the Bayfield crew agree. They told me they found nothing up there, and neither did Dick Race, who searched that area too. Yes, sir.
Well, what about the weak keel?
The weak keel, it's been documented. We saw the reports. You'll see in my book the drawings of where the keel was loose, where they actually cut out parts and refixed them. And I don't know if it was because of that weird flexing that's what it did. I always have that disclaimer, and you'll see it in the book, that the truth is I'm a newspaper or a television reporter, a radio DJ, for crying out loud, not a ship architect. So as I look at these things, the only thing I can really do is talk to the experts myself. And I don't think anybody's done as many interviews, with the people who sailed it, who built it, who investigated it, Jean-Michel Cousteau, all of the people. I've gotten their 2 cents, and I've kind of put it together to what makes sense for me, and then leave it in a book for other people to look at. So, yeah, I hope I've covered it, but I certainly didn't solve it. In the very back, sir.
You don't have a song for it, but have you ever covered the Bradley?
Oh, there is a song for it now. This is the beautiful part about Gordon didn't do it, but because of all the interviews I've done with especially Frank Mays, who survived that, he gave us an incredible interview. We went and dove the Bradley in '95, which is a whole nother talk. We could do 2 hours on the Carl Bradley, the largest shipwreck in Lake Michigan, 360 feet deep. The song is incredible. David O. Norris wrote it with Dan Hall. It's called When the Bradley Was Torn and Then Gone. And you will love it. There's one about the Cedarville. There's one about so many of the stories that they take the interviews I do and turn them into incredible songs. So not at the caliber, I wouldn't say caliber, not at the money maker that we might have had with Gordon, but certainly Dan Hall's music, and that of Stan Rogers.
It's got the prop in the Rogers City in the park.
Not from, that's actually from another ship. The prop is still, yeah, the prop on the Bradley's still there. In fact, our submarine went underneath it, and it freaked us out pretty bad. We canceled all dives after that when we realized it was sitting in the midsection buried. And yes, in the very back.
Was it just the one body that was found from the wreck of the?
Yeah, and people always come up with, oh, they certainly saw it. Now, if Whitefish Point Museum, and I'm a board member now, back when they brought the bell up, I wasn't a part of that group. When they dove it in 90 or 89, I wasn't part. There's always a rumor that they'd seen more because they covered a lot more hours underwater. We had 16 hours of footage from our dives, and so we don't know exactly how much is there. Of the area that they might have covered, but I don't believe that was found, and Whitefish Point promised to destroy any footage. It was not in their best interest, certainly, to have any footage up there. The family members, that is their memorial place. And it's a balance for me as a board member to be a guy that tells all the truths of the shipwreck, but also respects very much these families that lost 29
What would be the state of the bodies?
It's hard to talk about because, again, part of me as a forensic, I was a sheriff's diver. We would recover people from the river in Saginaw. That's what we did. So there's that part, and then there's also the respect of the families that are just bothered every time we talk about it. So I cover a little bit in the book, but I certainly don't go into big detail, but surprisingly well. The wreck of the Kamloops is well known. 1927, the engineer is still floating inside there, and it was lost in 27. So that is, they don't look like, they're this shape, but sadly, it's not a wonderful grave by any means, but it is their grave, and I respect that every time I go down to see these wrecks. Yes?
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of video coverage, and it sounds like in the book, there's a lot of it you haven't seen and would like to see.
Yeah, if you think about it, when you go down, and I went down with Tom Knab, another famous Bay City guy, fantastic videographer for TV5, and our job was to get pictures of the Edmund Fitzgerald, and you don't go out in the midsection, that's not pretty. You don't go looking for clues when you have an hour. Our job is to make sure we get the best, so we went around the bow and got the name and the pilot house, and we couldn't go inside the window. It's against the Canadian permit. You couldn't put lighting inside there, so we got all we could there, and then we got lost for 40 minutes, and then tried to get over to the stern and cover everything we could there, but it's all buried in the mud. You can't even see, a handful of portholes back there. So we didn't see the midsection. Now, in 1994, the Clelia, McGinnis said, well, I'm going to make a map. And he promised in all the interviews that I'm going to do a very detailed map. I called the university that supposedly made the map. They said, yeah, it's lost. Who loses a map to the Edmund Fitzgerald? Clearly a lot of stuff when you're getting government funds to do these things are not taken to the limit of what they said in the interviews, and it didn't happen. But the one thing I can say about Expedition 94, and God bless Shannon, we didn't always see eye to eye. This guy said it the way it was, gave everything that he said he was going to do except the book. I made the video and stuff. We did what we said we were going to do, and we got it done. And in many ways, because we did find the body, I think that points to we did a better job. I mean, if nobody else saw it, how could you say somebody else did a better job? And I think that's a testament to who he was. And again, like, we weren't bestie friends when he was, finally gone. He doesn't like me talking about the Fitzgerald, which you could imagine. He wanted to be the Fitzgerald guy, but he's gone now. Final question? Yes?
I heard from an expert that they trying to explain the ship broken in two and the stern upside down, that when the ship went up a wave and it had been leaking water, so it was very heavy, and then it dove down the wave and kept going. The stern came out of the water. He said that would make the propeller, now it doesn't have resistance from the water, would spin incredibly, and he said the torque from that would twist the stern off. And I have a cousin who's a chief engineer on a 1,000-footer, and he said, no, I don't buy that. He said it's geared. And he said the gear would, it's in low or high or whatever, but it's in a certain gear.
You
So
bet.
that would stop the propeller from spinning.
If you look back at all the stories, and I talked to a couple guys there in the engine room in 1940, on the throttles of those old steamers, especially the triple expansions, yeah, you rode that, you know, your job was to not torque it. On the Fitzgerald, here's my weirdest part. First, no cargo aft of the first section. The second is the back section, upside down, sits on a giant pile of taconite that it's skidded across. How is it possible that that wreck went down in one piece and then somehow the stern broke off and then skidded across a pile of its own taconite? It doesn't make any sense. So one piece, I don't see how that possibly could have done what we're seeing on the bottom. Now, will we eventually go back with new sonar? Probably. I think as you know, more and more family members get, you know, embraced, I think the immediate people who lost loved ones, sons and husbands, that voice is being sadly quieted because they're passing on now. I think that there'll be a push to try to figure out what happened with a sonar scan of that to see where the actual spillage was, and then dive down there and look at that midsection. Where are those plates? Is it right? In my book, I say hatch covers 2 and 3 are at the stern. How is that possible in the scenario that it blows apart in one piece, jabs its nose into the bottom, and then somehow the stern floats or twists 150 feet away? The Bradley's in one piece folded, ripped in the deck. The Morel, we know, ripped into 2 major pieces 5 miles apart from each other. That's what happens when a ship is still under power and keeps going, you know? So that's what I would have expected more on the Fitzgerald, not what I'm seeing. But again, I'm still baffled, and I've done a little research on it. So I can't even imagine what those final moments were, and many times I don't want to. It's so sad.
So you're not buying the
No.
torque from the propeller ripping?
No, it flipped itself somehow, and there's a reason for that. And it had to be the torque of the propeller. I mean, it was a massive, you know, system to do it. But out of control, out of the water, no. And for a ship not to see it behind them, that it all happened that fast, I just scratched my head to try to figure it out. I know you guys have been in here for a while, and I appreciate it. Sheila helped you with some books. Thank you so much.